Income accounts has been the dominant narrative for almost all countries around the world. And most policymakers ask one simple question: are we growing? And by growing, they mean the rise of gross domestic product per person. And we have known actually for many decades that this is a strange question because economic growth may or may not be correlated well with the quality of life of citizens. Many things that are measured in gross domestic product are not really measures of well-being. They can reflect high pollution, environmental destruction. They can reflect the huge inequalities of income. They can reflect the consumption of goods or services that don't really raise well-being. They don't measure well any non-market phenomena of environmental quality or degradation, congestion, crime, trust or lack of trust in the community, social support systems, and so forth. So our policymakers, by and large, are still directed towards gross domestic product, but reality is telling us, look in a different direction. And there are two strands of work right now that are important for you to contemplate. One, of course, is the direct measurement of subjective well-being, which is a big part of your conference. The idea that we now ask people around the world routinely, what is the quality of your life? What is your life satisfaction? Are you happy today? Were you happy yesterday? A various range of questions that include emotional type answers and analytical type answers. So there are different dimensions of happiness, but the idea is we ask directly. And all over the world, more and more governments are asking. More and more organizations like Gallup International, which we work closely with in the World Happiness Report, are asking these questions, both in the affective or emotional sphere and in the evaluative or analytical or life satisfaction sphere. The second main direction, I would say, is the idea of multidimensional goals for society. And interesting for us is the fact that all governments in the world have formally adopted, though you wouldn't know it yet, the concept of sustainable development as an organizing principle for a more holistic set of objectives and a more holistic set of measurements of well-being. So in 2012, on the 20th anniversary of the Earth Summit, which of course was in Rio de Janeiro in 1992, the governments of the world said, we subscribe to sustainable development in a rather specific sense, meaning the combination of economic, social, and environmental objectives. So they subscribe to sustainable development in a holistic sense of combining economic, social, and environmental objectives. And they announced in 2012 that as of 2015, all member states of the United Nations would adopt a set of sustainable development goals as a new set of guides for global development, what's called the post-2015 development agenda. So now we're in the last phase of setting those sustainable development goals. So what I would say for the state of Jalisco and for every other government, both the federal government of Mexico, the United States of America, and all other 191 governments, so together 193 governments of the United Nations, view this question of bienestar in these two senses. One, direct measure of well-being. And second, the adoption of sustainable development as a holistic framework with three major pillars: economic, social, and environmental pillars. Now, I hope that this will provide a kind of roadmap for governments going forward. We're not quite there yet because the Sustainable Development Goals will only be adopted in September 2015, but we're close to having them. So let me say a quick word about these two different categories of metrics. On the first, on subjective well-being, you'll hear from Richard Laird and Bruno Frey, and I know you have other great experts at the meeting, so I won't say too much, except to say that the research of these great scholars and many others have shown now very conclusively that people can give an accurate assessment of the quality of their lives or their life satisfaction, and we can relate the life satisfaction to various measurable inputs or determinants, of which one is the gross domestic product per capita, but others include the quality of governance, honesty and trust in government, the degree of generosity within the society, as measured, for example, by the share of the population that participates in voluntary giving activities or philanthropic activities, the social support systems in the society, the trust in the community, the public health in the population, measured, for example, by life expectancy or healthy life years. So John Helliwell has been one of the great leaders in the world of showing that the cross-country variation in subjective well-being is well explained by these phenomena, and that the one measure that we tend to use, the GDP per capita, explains only a relatively modest part of the total. And we've known that in the sense of the so-called Easterlin paradox in the United States, that US per capita GDP has tripled since the last 50 years, but the reported subjective well-being has not gone up. Something's gone wrong in American society. And we know it is falling trust, it is widening inequality, it is more corruption in our government. We see riots on the streets of Ferguson today. This is a reflection of a society that is very rich, but is very sick in a lot of ways, and why GDP per capita is not a good measure of American US well-being. Now, on this other dimension of sustainable development, let me just make a couple of points. We will have not one indicator, for example, life satisfaction, but many, many indicators grouped into these three big pillars: economic development, social inclusion, and environmental sustainability. By economic development, the indicators will include per capita income, rates of poverty, unemployment rates, and so forth. So I would say, to some extent, traditional measures of economic development. Social inclusion indicators will measure a great deal about inequality of income, the huge gaps that Mexico and the United States show between the rich and the poor. It could be the Gini coefficient, it could be the share of income and wealth of the top 1%, it could be the ratio of the top 10%, the bottom 10%, it could be the gaps between men and women in the labor market. It could be the racial differences in income and wealth, and so on. The third category of environmental sustainability will be measured by the issues of climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, conservation or loss of biodiversity, land use change, air and water pollution, destruction of habitat, ocean acidification, and so forth. So the idea is within less than 12 months now, because it will be September 2015, we'll have a set of indicators, dozens. We'll have a set of sustainable development goals, perhaps a dozen, that will help to define a more holistic framework for economic development. These are the two main points that I wanted to share. We are building in the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, SDSN, an initiative that includes the World Happiness Report, which we hope will be published every year or every other year, but also help for governments at the national and at the state level to implement the new Sustainable Development Goals. We are very keen to work with universities. So the Mexican universities, we want to become members of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network to help train a new generation of students, to do research on these topics, and to help work with government and civil society on introducing these concepts more generally into society. Even the Sustainable Development Goals should be localized, so they will be at the national level, they will be at the state level, but we hope that Guadalajara, for example, or New York City, or Baltimore, will have also at the city level Sustainable Development Goals to move this concept of a more holistic approach to economic development. These are the short thoughts that I wanted to share with you. I know it's been a long day. I'll stop here, turn it back to the moderator. But once again, many thanks for including me in this important meeting, and I look forward to the follow-up.
Well, let's try to see if Professor Sachs can hear us from where he is. Hopefully he says yes. I don't know if he's really listening because we have technical difficulties. But let me just ask a very quick question to Professor Sachs. Maybe someone in the back can ask him, what is the exact role or expectation from subnational governments in this network he's running, and specifically in implementing the Sustainable Development Goals? Many subnational authorities across the Latin American region are expecting to have a place, a role to play, a task, something, a responsibility in the implementation of the post-2015 developmental agenda. So in that sense, what would you say to all the governments which are not part of the national governments, who actually in the United Nations sometimes don't want to have other authorities, even from the same country, together discussing developmental goals?
Thank you. I think I've got the question. So let me just say how this process is supposed to look. The idea is that in September 2015, there will be actually, interestingly, the world's largest summit at the level of heads of state on the question of development that has ever taken place. Next year will be the 70th anniversary of the United Nations. And the UN is planning 3 days of head of state summitry on sustainable development. I'm quite excited by it because we never had the heads of state. globally assembled to discuss this issue with such intensity and depth. And I expect there will be 170 world leaders that at least attend the session next September. That will culminate in a set of sustainable development goals, or SDGs, as we say in English. And then and those goals will have goals, probably about a dozen, targets which are more specific underneath each goal. So maybe 40 targets in total, and maybe 100 quantitative indicators. And the idea is that every year, every government will report on the indicators and on the state of progress towards the global goals. For example, goals on health, on education, on narrowing inequalities of income, on reducing youth unemployment, on limiting human-induced climate change, and so forth. And there will be a new political institution created at the UN called the High-Level Political Forum, which will be essentially under the auspices of the head of state. And every year, ministers will review the world data on sustainable development, progress towards the SDGs. And every 4 years, there will be a global summit on world sustainable development. Are we going in the right direction, the wrong direction? Is climate change under control? Is it continuing to spiral out of control? And so forth. So this is the basic idea. Now, within every country, I would hope that this becomes a focus for the states like Jalisco and the cities like Guadalajara, as I said. In the United States, I'm trying to launch several city-level sustainable development goal initiatives right now so that one can downscale this kind of approach to the city level. Of course, this is all with hope that we can pay attention to this and create a new momentum in a new direction. Now, I should emphasize that some of those indicators that we are urging the heads of state to adopt will include the measures of happiness, direct measures. One of the recommendations that we're strongly making is that subjective well-being should be directly measured and monitored year by year as part of the Sustainable Development Goal process.
Excellent. Hope he's listening. Before opening the conversation with Professor Frey and Professor Helliwell, I just want to mention that part of the objective of this forum is to establish a Latin American network on subjective well-being and quality of life network that would help precisely to the purposes you were talking about. So we will keep in touch with the network you are running, and we would love to contribute to what you are doing, especially from the local and the regional perspective. So now I'm going to pass the voice to Professor Frey, who already was presented. So, Professor, please.
Thank you. The World Happiness Report is absolutely fantastic. I would really like you to read it because it gives you the scholarly level which we have attained today. And I think the talk by Jeffrey Sachs was equally excellent. But we want to have a discussion here. I don't want to repeat again that GNP is not the same as happiness, etc. You would be terribly bored. And my view is also, if there is a report which is not criticized, it's worth anything. It's just not worth anything. So I want to criticize it. And all the more because today we have a happiness industry. That's not my word. That has been coined by The Economist, a really first-rate weekly. So we have a happiness industry. We live in the year 2014. We don't live 1918 or 1919 or in the year 2000. Today, happiness is fully accepted. I think we should be clear about that. There is a happiness industry in the sense that there are very many interests which push happiness. It's, of course, governments, it's universities, it's interest groups, and it's international organizations. So we don't have to remind them that happiness is important. Moreover, the media are so interested in happiness, but the media make a mistake because they only consider numbers. They don't want to have content. They are interested in numbers, and so they always compare countries. And unfortunately, the happiness report is full of that. Comparisons of happiness and country scales and subjective well-being scales and life satisfaction indices over 190 or something countries. And of course the media have picked that up, but I think that's more or less nonsensical. It's not the right thing to do because there are we must take into account that people in different countries react differently to questions posed. So we should correct the indices by the constant in a happiness function. For instance, we heard that earlier, yesterday, a Japanese doesn't say that he is very happy. That's bad style. While an American, if you ask, how are you? Every American says, I'm great. We have to take these things into account, and otherwise we make country comparisons which make no sense. But I would like to emphasize that John Helliwell and Layard and Sachs are not very interested in these country comparisons. They want to go into content, and I value that greatly. But the fact that they publish so many in their report, they publish so many country comparisons, they go, unfortunately, in this direction. So my contribution is to be critical and perhaps to bring in some new insights. And in order to really challenge John, we now have evidence that people misrepresent their future happiness. We have strong evidence on that. And that's a new thing, and it's not included at all in the report. That's correct. That's all right that it is not included in the report, because a report shouldn't be too adventurous, because this misrepresentation is a new thing, but it is a very important thing. Let me give you two examples where there is a systematic misrepresentation about one's future utility. The first is, people think when they buy material goods that they derive higher happiness in the future from these goods. So if you buy a Ferrari, at least the men here, if the men buy a Ferrari, they think that it makes him very happy in the future. we have very good evidence that this is not the case. The same if you buy a new house, you think, I'll be very happy in the future. Not true. So a systematic overestimation of utility. The second example is with respect to commuting. When people are offered a job far away from where they live, which is higher paid, most people accept the job because they say, you know, commuting is no problem. I read the newspaper or I do something else while I travel. But according to their own evaluation afterwards, these people are less happy than they would be otherwise. So a systematic error. And now I would like to know what John is saying to these misrepresentations of future utility and what we should do.
Thank you. Is it all right if I remain seated under the weight of the attack? And what do you really think, Bruno? Don't be polite. Tell us what you really think. Bruno, as always, is evocative and challenging and interesting. And he wanted us to have not just a discussion, but he wanted to elevate it to a debate. So I'll do my best to play along. The two facts he mentioned at the very end of people misrepresenting, in other words, people making bad decisions, thinking they were doing something because it would make them happy, but it wouldn't. There is not anyone in this room who doesn't already know that. What brings people together studying subjective well-being in large measure is because they think if people are given more evidence about the subjective well-being they and others have, they will begin to investigate what it is about the lives of the unhappy ones that is there to be changed. And in the process of that, they find, just as Bruno has shown in his research, that there are systematic mistakes that people are making when they think they're doing something that will improve their lives, and it does not. There's a counterpart, by the way, to Bruno's point about overstating the happiness gains you will get from future material purchases. They equally systematically underestimate the happiness gains they will get from interactions with their family and friends. So they make a range of Faustian bargains, of which the commuting issue, which he mentioned and has been a primary scholar of, is there. Now, to make an argument, Bruno was then suggesting these things we know about human behavior and failures to get maximum well-being will somehow be made worse or exacerbated by publication of data about current levels of well-being couched in a book that tries to present the science about that well-being, so that those items that Bruno mentioned are all covered in some detail with references to his work in Chapter 3 of the First World Happiness Report. Now, we didn't repeat it in the second, because the whole idea is the First World Happiness Report was the one to set the scientific background as we saw it to that time, and it included a lot of studies of method difficulties and so on. It is quite apparent, you will notice, getting back to the point you started with Bruno first, about, I think this is, see if I'm quoting this right, you said it's irresponsible to publish country numbers for people's own evaluations of their happiness if you think there is some way in which there is a pattern of answers that differ across continents or cultures beyond the extent that's explicable by their life circumstances. And that's an interesting point, but let me dig a little bit deeper into it. Because you'll notice as we moved from the first World Happiness Report to the second, at the first one we had bars for everybody's average Cantrell ladder score, and we ordered them, and that fell into easily the trap that people who were only interested in the report to know where their country stood would find it easier to do that than if we did it alphabetically. And we have to admit also, in the second World Happiness Report, we not only put the scores in, but we numbered, so you didn't have to count down the page to find out how many countries down you were from the top. So in a way, guilty as charged, we've made it easy for people to find their ranks. But, you know, we have a lot of faith in people's abilities to ask questions and to be curious. It's one thing to know where you are, what your temperature is when you're feeling sick, or how tall you are relative to other people's heights. Then you want to know, A, does it matter, and B, why is it the case? So in the second World Happiness Report, we put in sub-bars. We defined a country called dystopia. Now, first of all, we used the model I explained yesterday that tried to explain the differences over time and across countries by those 6 key variables. If you were listening really closely and writing it all down, you'll have them as GDP per capita, healthy life expectancy, freedom to make your key life decisions, social support, generosity, and the closest we could come to a good trust measure, which was absence of corruption. Now, those 6 variables, they're the best we could do with available data to cover a whole of 160 countries. They explained almost 80% of the variation across countries. But that's only 80%. There's another 20, right? So anybody who then wanted to look at their score and said, why are we as high or as low as we are? They could look and say, well, 2 is the value for dystopia. That's what it would be if we had the world's lowest values of everything. And then we can see how much our own subjective well-being is estimated by these crazy guys with their computers to be above the level in the unhappiest possible country in the world. And so you can then, for the person who's curious enough to know why they're ranked, then they get the next piece. Now we get left with a residual, what isn't explained by the model and by dystopia, which is just a straight 2 in that report. And so Bruno is saying, well, we think before we publish the data, we should adjust the ones in Latin America to bring them down because there's an extra boost in happiness in Latin America we haven't explained. Is that a good idea? No. I thought I'd ask. Or we take the ones in East Asia and raise them by 1/3 of a point because there's some unhappiness, reported unhappiness, in East Asia that we haven't yet been able to explain. Well, we're pretty modest about this. We haven't been able to explain it. It may be that it's perfectly explainable, but we're not smart enough to have dug deep enough in societies to find out. And so it remains there as our error. Now, I think in this next report, we'll push a little further in Bruno's direction. Here's my suggestion, that maybe we should have a figure like the one I showed yesterday that shows you the actuals and it shows you the predicted by the model, and then it shows by the amount you're off that what your residual is. And then we'll put in, as we did then, the color coding. And so you've got right there the built-in to, as you can see it, not into the primary numbers, that would be cheating. That would be saying we know there's a particular effect that has something to do with answer styles and has nothing to do with real life, and we're taking it out. Well, not on your life would I do that. The thing about statisticians, they have to get the best numbers they can and report them without fear or favor. And that is what we try and do. And then to report all the issues about actual well-being behavior, actual behavior, as honestly as we can. So I think the points Bruno made are quite correct, But I think the way in which we present the data, I mean, put it this way, if it's wrong to present the data if you think there's some unexplained residual, then how are we to get anywhere from here? If we didn't have the data, if you didn't have the data, you wouldn't be able to present the theories, develop the theories, think of ways of explaining it, and the science would go nowhere. I said yesterday, we need the data, we need the science, we need the public interest, and we need the policy support. They all have to be coming along as fast as we can get them, or we won't get anywhere. Over to you.
Excellent explanation. We lost Professor Sachs, but the debate is here, so I pass directly to Professor Frey.
I'm of course delighted that you go into the right direction. I have another problem. At least one. John just said that the indices he constructs consists of 6 variables like GDP, health, social support, etc. But how are they weighted? What are the weights given to them? To say they are equally important, that is a totally arbitrary solution. Totally arbitrary. And I was somewhat surprised that in Bhutan, as the lady told us, they do exactly this. They say everything is equally important. But how can, for instance, health be equally important like GDP or GNP? Isn't that a ridiculous idea? When you are sick, how can you compare that to national income or to social support? I think that's exactly something which should we should think much more about this than just assign equal weight. Of course, I am aware that there is now research going on where the preferences on the weights are analyzed. But the question is, are these weights also relevant in the future? We look into the future and they should be relevant there. And secondly, we should use marginal weights, not average weights. So in other words, if somebody has a very high income, he of course gives higher weight to having friends. But when somebody has a very low income, he perhaps assigns more weight to income and less to to having friends. So the weights should not be constant over all levels, but they should be marginal. So my question is, isn't it perhaps better to have one question and one index, which is the overall question? Taken overall, how satisfied are you with your life? Because that means that every individual implicitly assigns weights to the various components of her or his happiness. And that's perhaps a better way than to have experts construct the weights.
I'm delighted to be having this conversation because I had never heard Bruno say that before. I've heard him say he didn't like fixed weights, but I've never heard him suggest fixed rates or what are used in here. I got into this field 20 years ago because I had been studying social capital, and we knew it was very important, trust and the way in which people connect with each other socially. But short of looking and seeing how it affected economic growth, we knew that had nothing to do with being the whole value. So how are you going to compare them with economic growth? And so we discovered there were, in fact, data around about people's evaluations of their lives. And ignorant me, I'd never seen these data before. I'm only going back about before the turn of the century. So I said, either this is what we have been looking for 200 years and not found, or it's nonsense. And I spent the succeeding period trying to find out if these data carried as much power and information as I hope they did, because if they did, they would change the way we saw society, the way it was analyzed, and the way policies were produced. It was precisely to get away from, you may remember in the 1980s, there was a social indicators movement, whereby we had a whole lot of indicators of the quality of life. And the movement died because there was no way to aggregate them. Similarly, we find a lot of people putting together right now well-being indicators for countries. In Canada, there is such an indicator, and Bhutan has done this in its own indicator, which are simply fixed weights or expert-given weights on different variables. Now, when I spoke of those bars in the overall score, first of all, let me say I'm doing exactly what we are doing in the report, exactly what Bruno wants us to do. The only score that's reported is the primary score. The sub-bars are the averages of the marginal weights that people themselves choose. Now, it's a very restricted way we do it. We say, let's choose these weights and the distribution of how much freedom people feel they have in Angola versus France, by the average effect that this, the average number of people who say they're free, and the average impact of looking across all the respondents that freedom has on people's reported life satisfaction. So we're using the data on the primary variable, we're using it as an umbrella, an overarching measure of well-being, whose power, if it works, whose power is to allow us to attach relative importance to income and freedom and social connections. And then once we have that, it then gives back to policymakers not pre-given weights from us or anybody else, but what people in their own votes about how happy they are implying about the quality of their own lives and the importance of these key factors that influence. It's the power of the overall life evaluations. If you look in table 2.1 of the latest World Happiness Report, you'll see our basic equation on the left, which I've just described, and then used its coefficients and the data to give these sub-bars. And then in the right-hand side of the table, we take the emotional measures, and in the middle of the table we explain the affect measures, positive and negative affect measures, and what you find, and this is fundamental to the strategy we take in the report, we find that there is a small fraction of the amount of international variance in the emotional measures that there is in the life evaluations. We find that the emotional measures have a strong impact on life evaluations, but they do not drive out the life conditions that are central. So just as Aristotle said 2 millennia ago, the life evaluation covers and responds to life circumstances in a very important way, and I've given you 6 of those. And it's also supported by positive emotions and detracted by negative emotions or emotional experiences. Are you safe at night, etc. And on the other side, and the British data show us this, there's nothing in Gallup that we would use and could use, we would if we could, life purpose. It's enormously important to have a purpose of life, and when you do, it supports the life, but it does not drive out the impact of these other circumstances. Some things, and this is interesting, some things like friends get a good part of their effect on your overall life satisfaction flowing through the emotional positive emotions that they give you. So time spent with family and friends improves your positive affect. And it's a good part of that. So when you put in positive affect 2 in the model, it takes down the effect of friends, which is saying friends are a mediating device. And indeed, social support, which is a little different, social support is about the only variable that's just as strong as a determinant of emotions as it is of life satisfaction. Most of the other circumstances are mainly the other way. So in shortcut, Bruno, I agree exactly with you. Fixed weights are to be avoided at all cost. And if there's anything in the science of well-being at the sort of macro level, it's in its ability to substitute evidence for arbitrary choices.
A third problem, and the last. The authors want governments to use happiness as a guide to policy. Now I'm in the policy field. And as I tried to say in my talk earlier today, I'm deeply concerned about the possibility of governments to manipulate these happiness indices as the goal. And several people asked me, how is it possible for the government to manipulate a happiness indicator, a happiness index? I would like to tell you that is extremely easy to do, because these are subjective data, and subjective data can be easily manipulated. I give you 3 examples how to do it. The first is just exclude a group. No, I must first say, if the government, most governments in power, want to push up the happiness index while they are in power, because then the population thinks that they are doing a great job. So how do you push up the result, the happiness indicator? The first way is just exclude a group with low happiness. In the United States, prisoners do not count as part of the population to be surveyed. They are not allowed to vote, and therefore they are just excluded. We heard that there are 2 million Americans in prison. So 2 million unhappy people are just thrown out. Or what about foreigners? Do they count if they are here in your country for 1 month, for 5 months, or for a year, or for 2 years? If they are happier than the population, the indigenous population, then of course you include them. If they are less happy, you throw them out. Very easy to do. Secondly, disregard the unhappy. That's very simple. If on the scale from 0 to 10, the answer to the question, taken overall, how satisfied are you with your life? Somebody says 2. You can say, that cannot be true. He would have to commit suicide, so throw him out. That's easy to do. And it's done. It's done. And the third is, if the happiness indicator doesn't suit you as the government, just create a new one. That has been often done for the case of inflation, the property of inflation, that then just create a new index and then you are well off. So my question to John now is...
A ver, ayer Bruno comentaba algo y voy a darle seguimiento a esa línea de ideas. Él decía que los individuos tendrían que ser estratégicos a la hora de dar una respuesta. Ahora usted está hablando de datos oficiales que están siendo tergiversados. Pero Alguien a la derecha no va a estar contento si hay un gobierno izquierdista. Y esto sería una conducta estratégica. Creo que la idea es, bueno, cambiar todo esto para hacer que las elecciones vayan a su favor. Sin embargo, usted sabe, y yo también sé, que este factor ya conlleva una gran cantidad de investigación. Hay gente que vive mucho más feliz en los gobiernos o bajo la tutela de gobiernos que comparten sus ideas políticas. Entonces, obviamente, ese gobierno va a crear políticas que van a favor del bienestar de estas personas que están votando por ellos, que están de acuerdo con lo que está sucediendo. Entonces, las encuestas en países en los cuales nada tiene que ver con el gobierno, los gobiernos no tienen la menor idea de lo que las respuestas representan. Entonces, Bruno decía ayer que una vez que los datos se tomen más en serio, va a haber más de ese tipo de votos o más evaluaciones. Y obviamente los científicos van a decir, bueno, esperemos qué pasa. Yo creo que no va a ser así, pero la pregunta es la siguiente. ¿Qué pensamos en este sentido? Bueno, tenemos muchas formas de medir todo lo que sucede alrededor de nosotros y la probabilidad. Por ejemplo, los gobiernos no van a tener acceso a los datos de Gallup y manipularlos. Bueno, hay algunas excepciones de las cuales podría hacer mención, pero normalmente no sucede. Incluso si tienes una encuesta oficial que sea alterada en cierta forma, la existencia de encuestas privadas que existen ahí indican una brecha marcada. Por ejemplo, los números oficiales son 0.5 mejor y todas las demás están mal. Entonces, obviamente, alguien tiene que ser cuestionado. Por ejemplo, Snowden en los Estados Unidos o otras personas que podrían aclarar por qué la brecha está tan marcada. Entonces, lo oficial aquí es entender cómo esta es una operación políticamente riesgosa y no hay ganancia política, no hay ninguna ganancia política cuando esto sucede. Y cuando hablas de datos no representativos o que no son representativos porque hay mucha gente que no cuenta, bueno, sí, los prisioneros no cuentan para muchas encuestas, pero esto aplica para muchos tipos de encuestas, no solamente para estas. Entonces, esta cuestión tiene que ver con el hecho de contar bien a la población en todos los sectores y no solamente para el sector del bienestar, sino en otro tipo de encuestas de otra índole. Estamos tratando de establecer, y recuerden por favor que yo comenté lo mismo pero con palabras diferentes. No siento sospecha intrínseca de los gobiernos y de la burocracia. Me parece que ellos son gente como nosotros y que también tienen la probabilidad de pensar en el interés público como nosotros lo hacemos. Y entonces, normalmente lo que pasa es que no están siendo estratégicos cuando aplican sus acciones. Entonces, sé que hay ciencias políticas involucradas y son cuantitativas, por lo menos en lo que a mí concierne. Sé que los economistas piensan que la gente es egoísta por pensar en sí mismos, lo cual es falso, y esto se transmite a la literatura económica y se indica que los gobernantes también son autointeresados o son egoístas. Creo que no es cierto o que no aplica para todos. Comento también esto porque las guías para medir el bienestar subjetivo, lo cual está siendo adoptado, no en todo el mundo, pero por lo menos en la mitad del planeta Tierra, se desarrollaron por oficinas de estadísticas nacionales y no hay muchas oficinas como el equivalente del INEGI que quieren ser o estar bajo el control del gobierno en la forma en que llevan a cabo sus grandes encuestas de gran alcance. Por ello, grandes agencias empezaron a divisar o visualizar estrategias a nivel nacional para poder hacer esto en forma correcta. Si ustedes trabajaran en un sentido rutinario, obviamente los resultados también serían rutinarios y puedes inventar números que serían diferentes cada vez. Hay una diferencia, sin embargo, hoy en día.
Creo que es más probable que existan con estos datos de bienestar, porque habrá módulos, como ya escuchamos a partir de el reporte de la OCDE. Hoy es un modelo que es muy claro, muy simple y que puede servir a las encuestas que se realicen en todo el mundo. Entonces, en cuanto a generalidades, encontraremos que las propiedades estadísticas y todo lo demás relacionadas con ellas se conoce bastante bien. Pero ¿qué pasa con los extranjeros? Este es un negocio que trae trampas. Cuando empezamos a trabajar con esto por primera vez en Florencia, no pusimos demasiada atención atención en esto y creo que es de suma importancia si tomamos esta base de residentes o base de gente nacional para considerar incluso sus niveles tanto de ingreso como de felicidad, y sabemos que tenemos que cubrirlos a todos, a los prisioneros incluso. Entonces, si no incluimos a estos trabajadores invitados o a la población de residentes de otros países, entonces, ¿cómo vamos a considerar esto? Aquellos gente de la India que trabaja en Estados Unidos, ellos tendrían que contarnos entonces en la India si no los contamos en Estados Unidos. Es muy simple. La misma forma en la que se operan los censos en todos los países también tienen que practicarse en los residentes extranjeros, en donde todo mundo conteste en relación a su país de residencia. Y esto desde principios del 2013 se ha considerado que, por ejemplo, los países árabes que se encuestan mediante la encuesta de Gallup, solo incluyó a los ciudadanos árabes. Entonces, los trabajadores invitados, muy numerosos en algunos de estos países árabes, no se les encuestó. A nosotros no nos gustó esto, y entonces hicimos todo lo posible para que se reportara esto también a los Emiratos Unidos Árabes, para que entonces estos reportes sean más creíbles y puedan ser más útiles para ellos mismos si conocen el bienestar de todos sus residentes y no nada más de los ciudadanos de sus países. Y entonces esto puede servirles más a los ciudadanos, más incluso que a aquellos residentes extranjeros. Ahora tenemos este caso de que los países se les encuesta ya sea por teléfono o en línea acerca de su lugar de residencia, y trata de hacerse esto con una representación de las poblaciones completas, y esto tiene que admitirse. Y algunos de estos países, los números reales, sí, en este caso todavía no se sabe bien y no queda totalmente claro, y podemos ver el problema que Gallup tiene para llenar estos espacios, especialmente en aquellos países donde hay muchos inmigrantes ilegales, en donde va a ser difícil llegar a ellos mediante estas encuestas, pero así es la vida, y también cuesta trabajo tener encuestas en ciertos países, pero estas encuestas están ahí para servir a la gente, sirven de consulta para algunos países. Hay regiones donde no se ha hecho, y por supuesto también existen los países en donde hay menos niveles de felicidad en todo el mundo. Entonces, en cuanto tengamos bien los principios, vamos a hacer lo mejor posible. Si pienso que hay gobiernos nacionales que le den la vuelta a esto e empiecen a excluir a los extranjeros una vez que se pueden salir con la suya, yo no lo creo, pero será obvio si sucede, porque de hecho una de las variables que tenemos en la encuesta Gallup, y que es cierto y sirve también para la encuesta nacional, es dónde naciste, entonces queda muy bien reportada quiénes son los extranjeros, y es ahí donde podemos incluirlo a los ciudadanos. Y entonces hay también, ¿cuál era la otra? También no considerar a los infelices, a los que no son felices. Bueno, no tiene sentido para mí que alguien haga esto. Una vez que tienes datos, de todas formas, entonces vas a publicar todos los datos y vas a permitir que los datos caigan donde deban caer. ¿Eso respondió adecuadamente? ¿Fue suficientemente largo? No sé si respondí bien, sin embargo. Hagamos una ronda final de comentarios, y ya son las 8, hemos tenido un debate maravilloso, así es que 2 intervenciones más. Solo quiero decir que los políticos son gente buena, como lo sabemos si consideramos cuántas tareas han asumido, cuántas guerras han luchado, cuánta gente han destruido. Creo que los políticos son exactamente lo mismo, el mismo tipo de personas que ustedes, que yo, que John. Es igual, solo se trata de gente común y corriente, no son mejores a nosotros. Sin embargo, el problema es que cuando entran, asumen un cargo, ellos están literalmente constreñidos por esto, y de ahí empiezan a comportarse en forma diferente, y lo podemos percibir en muchísimas formas. Tenemos oponentes políticos que son maravillosos. En cuanto asumen el poder, 2 meses después ya se comportan exactamente igual que el dictador al que derrocaron. Lo hemos visto muchísimas veces en Sudamérica, en África y en todos los demás lugares. Entonces, la forma en la que podemos restringir a los políticos es haciendo que haya buenas instituciones, que haya buenas constituciones que los obliguen a alinearse a las preferencias de sus votantes. Desafortunadamente, creo que son muy pocos las oficinas de estadística nacional que no dependen de los gobiernos en el poder. Así es que al menos tenemos que tener cierto optimismo en relación a esto, pero es eso. Es maravilloso cómo John reacciona a lo que a mí, con lo que yo lo ataco, y opta de verdad por hablar de lo bueno que es el reporte acerca de la felicidad en el mundo. Gracias, profesor. El proceso de la gobernanza se puede mejorar. Bruno ya ha estudiado esto, sabe muchísimo de esto. Hay resultados en Suiza que muestran que nadie pasa por alto por esto. Es de verdad un resultado considerado. Y aquellos que tienen mayor capacidad de manejar sus propios asuntos con democracia directa, consultando a la gente, les va mejor que a los demás. Y bueno, él ya habló de este principio ayer, y entonces quiero hacer un comentario aquí, y si hay un comentario, y si estos se involucran directamente, él lo ha llevado a lo que tiene que ver con las metas en el proceso electoral, pero nosotros hemos realizado mucho trabajo en cuanto a qué tanto mejora el bienestar cuando tenemos la calidad de entrega en los servicios que proporciona el gobierno, o al completar procesos que son totalmente democráticos. Y encontramos que el primero es mucho más importante que el segundo que mencioné. Y debo decir que hemos llegado a niveles muy altos de eficiencia y honestidad del servicio público, y entonces a la gente le empieza a importar y a querer tener control sobre lo que hay. Y la gente muchas veces empieza a temerle al gobierno. El nuevo tipo de gobierno que ahora llega y que se publica en muchos artículos y que del que hay muchas propuestas, ahora es totalmente diferente. Ahora desata el poder de los individuos para que ellos, dentro de su adhesión comunitaria, dentro de sus vecindarios, piensen en formas mejores de hacer las cosas y llevarlas a cabo, y después compartir sus ideas con otras jurisdicciones. Y como ya lo dijo él, es maravilloso que ahora el estado de Jalisco esté comenzando con esto. Es mejor empezar desde los niveles más bajos. ¿Por qué? Bueno, pues porque va a ser mucho más fácil. Nada sucede a menos que puedan mover esto del yo al nosotros, y podemos hablar de la sociedad, de la entidad social, que entonces la gente se asume como un nosotros. No sirve que haya otra persona dentro de tu equipo de fútbol. No, son todos un equipo. Entonces aquí, en cuanto a estas cosas, podemos pensar en el mismo equipo y empecemos a trabajar en conjunto, y así podemos innovar, y ahí podemos compartir riesgos, y ahí no tenemos que romper reglas en representación de nadie más, o repararlas si algo pasa, que podemos contar con nuestro orgullo de haber descubierto algo que sí funciona, y después compartirlo con las demás jurisdicciones que son similares a nosotros en nuestro mismo lugar, en nuestro país, en otros lugares, para entonces poder hacer algo que nos permita trabajar a partir de nuestra imaginación con nuestros gobiernos. Y esto es algo que será una gran ventaja para nosotros, y también una gran ventaja para la gente con quien colaboremos. Y entonces, desde mi punto de vista, esto es positivo, es un estilo positivo de gobierno que ya muestra signos de avanzar. Y ciertamente, si nosotros seguimos la evidencia que se da ahora en el reporte de felicidad mundial, muestra en forma consistente, y más allá de eso, no nada más de los datos que trae ahí, sino de muchos experimentos relacionados, que la gente que se involucra directamente en el manejo de sus propias vidas y ayuda a los demás, y forma o logra que se formen instituciones gubernamentales que den buenos servicios, los servicios se van volviendo cada vez más eficientes. Y creo que bajo esto, Bruno y yo debemos decir que eso es como debe ser, así es como debe ser. Excelente. Bueno, muchísimas gracias a los dos, y también quiero agradecer al profesor Sachs. Y bueno, estamos al final de este día. Mañana va a ser nuestro último día, así que nos vemos mañana.